from the broadcast studio, hitting in the static. This ain't no bedtime story, son, it's prophetic. Encrypted signals from the shadows of the garden. We dig where the dirt got secrets, no parting. Microphone alchemist, scriptures with a twist. Peep the frequency, seeds in the mist. We drop bars like plagues, revelations in the cadence. Broadcasting truth while they trapped in surveillance. Wisdom with a watchman's blade. Fourth watch style while your whole system fade. Blood moons, Nephilim, echoes in the pine. Sasquatch stomping through the fault lines of time. We ain't mainstream, we ancient stream. Cypher with the prophets, decode the dream. So if you tuned in, better guard your mind. It's broadcasting seeds and we breaking the design.
Pull up a chair, friend. Today, we are not just reading scripture. We are kicking open a door that most Sunday schools just keep locked. I'm Bennett Tanton, and this is Broadcasting Seeds, where we treat the Bible like a classified intelligence file and history like a crime scene. If you're new here, welcome to the weird part of the library. If you have been with me for a while, you already know where the bodies are buried and allegedly, mostly. Here's the working theory. Deuteronomy hints at something that rewires how we look at geopolitics, religion, and even the nightly news. After Babel, God did not simply confuse human languages and send everyone to their corners. The text suggests that God divided the nations and placed them under the administration of lesser divine beings, like little g gods, the sort of cosmic middle management that looks tidy in a chart, but it gets messy in real life. Israel, however, God kept as his personal portion. That means Israel sits on the fault line of the supernatural Cold War that has been humming under the floorboards of history since the dawn of civilization. So let me put it this way. Most of us were taught that history is people and policies, kings, coups, treaties, and trade routes. Deuteronomy invites a darker and stranger layer. It says there that thrones behind thrones, spiritual jurisdictions, principalities, and powers that do not run for office and do not care about your approval ratings. You see, the shadow in Psalms where God calls a council to account and tells the so-called gods that their time is up if they rule unjustly. You see the spark at Babel, where human ambition collides with divine limits. You see the flashpoint in Israel, where God plants his flag in contested territory and refuses to outsource management. So I grew up with maps on the wall, colors, borders, legends, distance, scales. Deuteronomy tells me there is a second map layered over the first. The borders are older than empires and the legends read like warnings. This is why Israel often feels like the center of the cyclone. It is not just politics. It is a jurisdictional dispute in the unseen realm, spilling into open conflict in the seen world. And if that sounds dramatic, good. It's supposed to. The Bible is not embarrassed by its supernatural worldview. We should stop apologizing for it and start following the leads. Here's how tonight will run. First, we will revisit Babel and pull the tape on what the text actually says, not what we wish it said. Then we will look at Israel as God's outpost, a forward operating base in a world managed by questionable landlords. Next, we will profile those lesser divine beings, some loyal, some are rogue. Then we will zoom out to the empires from Assyria to modern superpowers and ask whether the fingerprints of unseen rulers are still on the doorknobs. And then finally, we'll step into the cosmic courtroom where God puts corrupt spiritual authorities on notice and reclaims the nations through a very unexpected strategy. Quick ground rules. We quote the text. We keep our feet on the ground while our eyes check the skies. We are not here to sensationalize things. We are here to trace a pattern that runs from Genesis to Revelation and straight into your newsfeed. You do not need a PhD to track this. You need curiosity, a Bible, and the willingness to consider that the world is bigger and stranger than your civics teacher told you. If this show adds value, hit like, share it with a friend who loves this weird history and weirder theology, and drop a review. That is how the show grows. Section 1. The Babel fallout. When nations become someone else's problem. So, all right. Let's rewind the tape back to Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel. You probably know the flannel graph version, right, from church. Humanity wanted to build a tower to heaven. God didn't like it. So he scrambled the languages like an old radio dial, and everyone went home confused. End of story, right? Not so fast, though. That's the Sunday school version. The text, and especially Deuteronomy's lens on it, paints something far more sinister. What if Babel wasn't just about God making sure you couldn't order a sandwich in Akkadian when your neighbor only spoke Hittite? What if it was a jurisdictional restructuring of planet Earth? Genesis says the nations were scattered, but Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9 add the classified addendum. God divided the nations according to the number of the sons of God. In other words, he hands out territory assignments to these lesser divine beings, the Elohim, like a cosmic HR department dropping new orders on Friday afternoon. The nations, they're no longer directly under Yahweh's administration. He delegates and outsources. Some scholars call it the divine council worldview. I call it the moment history became a supernatural Cold War. Now, if this was just paperwork, that's no big deal. But these divine beings, not all of them were Boy Scouts. Some strayed, some stayed loyal, others turned into warlords with celestial security clearances. Psalm 82 shows God dragging these rulers into court and blasting them for running their nations like mob bosses, showing partiality and neglecting justice and oppressing the poor. So picture Babel, not as a funny story about messing up grammar, but as a ignition point where the world gets fractured into pieces, each piece falling under a different spiritual landlord. Israel is the exception. God keeps one slice for himself. The Lord's portion is his people, Jacob, his allotted inheritance. Deuteronomy 32:9. That means, from the very start, Israel isn't just another tribe. It's God's embassy planted right in contested space. And here's where it gets wild. The Bible suggests that the struggles of Israel, wars, invasions, exiles, aren't just political disasters. They're the side effect of being ground zero in a supernatural turf war. Think about it. Every nation since has had its own flavor of gods, myth, and rulers. Mesopotamia had Marduk, Egypt with Ra, Greece with Zeus, Rome with Jupiter. From this perspective, those aren't just quaint mythologies, they're distorted echoes of the divine rulers placed over them at Babel. Rulers who went rogue. And history, every war, every rise and fall of empire becomes less about human pride and more about cosmic management gone wrong. Here's the takeaway. The Babel fallout wasn't just confusion, it was fragmentation. Nations went from one god over all to a patchwork of lesser gods holding sway, some benevolent, some were corrupt. That's the real story, hiding under Genesis 11. And once you see it, you start looking at the map differently. Borders stop being just lines on paper. They're spiritual fault lines. And Israel, that's the eye of the storm. The one nation still directly tethered to the Creator while everyone else is living under a spiritual landlord with questionable Yelp reviews. Section 2. Israel, God's outpost in enemy territory. Okay. If Babel was the great handoff, then Israel is the exception clause. When God divided up the nations, he didn't just scatter the people and walk away. Deuteronomy 32:9 drops a bomb, but the landlord's portion is his people, his allotment inheritance. In plain English, while the rest of the world went under new management, Israel stayed under direct ownership. No middleman, no divine subcontractors. Yahweh planted his flag and said, "This one's mine." But here's the catch. Israel wasn't dropped into some quiet corner of the world where they could sing psalms and tend sheep and peace. No, they were planted smack in the ancient Near Eastern equivalent of a biker bar, a hot zone crawling with competing gods, empires, and cults. Canaan wasn't a cozy starter home. It was a front line, base camp in hostile territory. That's why the Old Testament reads less like a Hallmark movie and more like an episode of Band of Brothers. Israel was always under siege, not just by flesh and blood, but by the unseen powers working through the nations around them. So let's zoom out. Egypt had its pantheon, each god tied to a piece of creation. The Nile, the sun, the underworld. Babylon had Marduk, the storm god who supposedly beat back chaos. The Philistines had Dagon, the half-man, half-fish deity who could have walked straight out of a Lovecraft novel. These weren't just random statues and superstitions. And from the divine council lens, they were the public faces of the spiritual authorities ruling those nations. And Israel was the stubborn neighbor who refused to bow, burn incense, or play along. That refusal made them a perpetual problem. Empires don't like it when their gods get disrespected. Look at Pharaoh in Exodus. This wasn't just politics. It was a spiritual smackdown. Each plague wasn't random. It was a direct hit on Egypt's gods. Yahweh was demonstrating that he wasn't just another regional deity in a pantheon. He is the CEO over all creation, and Israel was his signature project. But being God's outpost came with a price. Israel wasn't just hated because they were different. They were targeted because They represented a threat to the spiritual status quo. Every invasion from Assyria to Babylon to Rome wasn't just geopolitics. It was an assault on the one embassy in the world that answered directly to the Most High. Imagine being the only house in town flying a different flag while someone else belongs to rival warlords. You'd expect constant raids, and that's exactly what we see through Israel's history. All right. Now, Israel's survival against all odds is one of the most bizarre threads in human history. Empires rose and fall, gods were worshipped and forgotten, borders shifted like sand dunes, but Israel persisted, not because they were stronger, smarter, or better organized. If anything, their constant failure should have buried them long ago. Yet, the thread never snapped. Why? Because the point wasn't Israel's strength. The point was God using Israel as his beachhead, his proof of concept that he could and would reclaim the nations one way or another. So when you read the Old Testament, don't skim past Israel's endless wars, exiles, and prophetic warnings as if they're just historical noise. They're dispatches from a supernatural embassy under siege. Israel was never just about Israel. They were a cosmic middle finger to the rebel gods, a living declaration that Yahweh wasn't ceding his world, no matter how fractured it looked. Section 3, divine bureaucrats or rogue overlords, the fate of the lesser gods, the little g gods. So let's talk about these lesser gods. The cosmic middle managers, the divine council appointees, and when the nations were handed over to Babel, this wasn't supposed to be a free-for-all. Think of it like a federal government assigning governors. The job description was clear. Steward the nations, uphold justice, reflect the rule of the Most High. That was the theory, right? But theories have a nasty habit of imploding when power and ego get involved. Enter Psalm 82, one of the strangest and most underpreached chapters in the Bible. Here's the scene. God takes his place in the divine council. Picture a cosmic courtroom, and he doesn't come with gold stars and commendations. He's coming with indictments. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. It's God basically saying, you had one job and you blew it. The verdict? You are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men, you shall die and fall like princes. That's divine pink slips with the side of eternal consequences. All right. Here's where the rabbit hole gets deeper. Ancient cultures were not shy about naming their spiritual patrons. Babylon's Marduk, Canaan's Baal. Greece had Zeus, Jupiter was Rome's, and from a biblical perspective, these weren't just myths. They were the public brands of the very being gods that God was rebuking. Over time, the line blurred between worship and tyranny. Instead of guiding nations towards righteousness, the rulers turned their territories into cult followings, demanding sacrifice, loyalty, and some even blood. If you think this is just ancient superstition, hold up. The New Testament doesn't back off this worldview. Paul calls them principalities and powers. He warns that Our real struggle isn't against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, authorities, and cosmic powers over the present darkness. That's Ephesians 6:12. That's not metaphor. That's a continuation of the divine council drama from Deuteronomy and Psalms. The lesser gods didn't just fade into history, they rebranded and they evolved. They traded temples for ideologies, statues for systems. But the game is the same. Keep nations bowed to anything but the true God. Now, the question is, did all of them go rogue? The text doesn't say every single one became a villain. Some may have held the line, staying faithful. But the majority, they seem to have been hijacked, their authority for personal glory. That's why history books like The Graveyard of Empires built on oppression, slavery, and bloodshed. You can almost hear the echoes of corrupt spiritual landlords pulling strings behind the curtains of kings and councils. Think about it, like corporate corruption on a cosmic scale. The CEO delegates expecting his manager to, the CEO delegates expecting his managers to follow the handbook. Instead, they raid the coffers, abuse the staff, and run their branches like a mob family. That's the picture Deuteronomy and Psalms 82 sketch. And the kicker is, God isn't ignoring it. He promises judgment. These divine beings may look untouchable, but their day in court is coming. So next time you hear about the gods of Egypt, Greece, Rome, and even modern ideologies treated with religious zeal, don't dismiss them as relics of primitive minds. From the biblical worldview, they're footprints of rogue rulers, divine overlords, who traded their stewardship for self-worship, and humanity has been caught in the fallout ever since. Section 4, Geopolitics as Spiritual Warfare, the Chessboard of Empires. Here's where things get a little dicey. We love to think of geopolitics as rational maps, treaties, alliances, and economic interests. But if you take the divine council worldview seriously, history starts looking less like the careful rise and fall of nations and more like a spiritual chess game with humanity as pawns and empires as rooks, knights and queens pushed around by unseen hands, right? Take Assyria and Babylon. To us, they're just ancient superpowers, the bullies of the ancient Near East. But to Israel, they weren't just geopolitical headaches, they were weapons in the hands of rival spiritual powers. Isaiah and Jeremiah both describe God using these nations as instruments of judgment. But there's always a hint that something deeper is going on. Babylon, for example, isn't just another empire. It becomes a symbol of cosmic rebellion, the human face of a darker supernatural agenda. By the time we get to Revelation, Babylon isn't even a city anymore. It's an archetype for the ultimate counterfeit kingdom, a stand-in for every empire that serves the wrong master. Fast forward through history, you have Greece rises under Alexander. Rome crushes and expands with military precision. Each of these empires isn't just about human ambition. They embody spiritual currents. Paul's warning in Ephesians 6:12 hits harder when you realize he was writing under the shadow of Rome. He wasn't saying spiritualize or struggles as a metaphor. He was pointing out that the Roman eagle carried with it not just military might, but a spiritual power that demanded worship, allegiance, and ultimately blood. Now, what about today? let's not get naive here, okay? Nations still posture. Economics still rise and fall. And leaders still give speeches about freedom and unity. But the Bible suggests there's always another layer. Behind every ideology, communism, fascism, even the kind of hyper-nationalism that defies the state, there's a spiritual undertone. Empires don't just collapse because of bad fiscal policy or poor military strategy. Sometimes they rot from the inside because the spiritual power steering them runs out of rope. It's not just ancient history either. Look at the 20th century, the rise of Nazi Germany with its occult underpinnings, the Soviet Union, their militant atheism, not just rejecting God, but installing an anti-God ideology as a substitute religion. These weren't just political experiments gone wrong. From a divine counsel lens, they look a lot like nations bowing to the influence of rogue powers. Now, before you think this is about demonizing every government or waving flags for one nation over another, let's pause. The biblical view isn't my nation good, your nation bad. It's way more radical. It says more nations outside of God's claim are under the sway of something else. Israel wasn't the hero because they were morally better. They were the hero because God claimed them as his. And through them, he launched a plan to reclaim the rest of the chessboard. So what's the takeaway? Next time you look at the news with wars, power struggles, elections, I want you to remember, geopolitics is never just about geopolitics, borders, armies, ideologies. That's the surface layer. Understand there's a supernatural Cold War that's been running since Babel. And if you're only watching the surface, you're missing the real game being played here, folks. Section 5, the Cosmic Courtroom, Judgment of the Gods. If the Babel fallout scattered the nations and turned history into a supernatural test match, then Psalm 82 gives us the endgame. It's a courtroom drama, but not the kind you binge watch on Netflix. This is a cosmic kind. God assembles the divine council, not for a strategy meeting, but for judgment. He calls out all these lowered, little g or lesser gods, the ones who were supposedly to rule justly, and instead turn their nations into playgrounds of oppression. He states, "You are gods, son of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men, you shall die and fall like any prince." That's the gavel drop. The verdict, guilty. The sentence, stripped of immortality, stripped of power, destined to be dismantled. That sets the stage for the prophets who keep pointing toward a future where Yahweh himself doesn't just reclaim Israel, he reclaims all of the nations. Isaiah's dream of a day when Egypt and Assyria, sworn enemies of Israel, will be counted as God's people too. Zechariah talks about the nations streaming to Jerusalem, not in conquest, but in worship. And then you get the mic drop of the New Testament. Jesus sending his disciples out with the Great Commission. That's not just evangelism, that's invasion. That's Yahweh saying, time to take back the pieces of the board, one nation at a time. And here's the twist. No one saw it coming. Instead of waging this war with armies, God wages it with a crucified Messiah at the cross. Paul says in Colossians, can't even say that, Colossians 2:15, Jesus disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame, triumphing over them. That's battlefield language. The cross wasn't just forgiveness for individuals, it was a cosmic takedown. The moment the rebel gods lost their claim to the nations, the resurrection, that's the victory parade. But Revelation doesn't let us off the hook. It shows us Babylon again, not just as a city, but as the archetype of every empire that sells its soul to these powers. It shows us the final courtroom session when the beast and the dragon, the great symbols of corrupt power, get thrown down for good. That's the day the divine council drama ends. The day that rogue overlords are erased from the board and the kingdoms of the world become the kingdom of our Lord. Until then, we live in that in-between. Nations still flex, power still rise, systems still demand allegiance. But the Christian claim is that their days are numbered. The cosmic court has already ruled. The sentence is already written. What remains is the cleanup operation. And that's why, for all the darkness in history, there's this strange undercurrent of hope, right? Because the same God who didn't abandon Israel at Babel hasn't abandoned the nations either. The outpost is expanding. The embassy is growing. And the chessboard, it's being flipped one square at a time. So the next time you hear about global politics, don't just think tanks and policy papers. Remember the other courtroom, the one from Psalm 82, opened and Revelation closes. That's the reminder that the battle isn't just against flesh and blood, and the victory won't come from ballots or bullets alone. It will come from the one who already proved he's the judge of the gods and men alike. Closing this episode out, and there you have it. Deuteronomy's hidden bombshell. Hidden bombshell. The nations weren't just divided geographically, they were divided spiritually. From Babel's fallout to Israel's role as God's embassy, from corrupt divine bureaucrats to empires that look like puppets, more like puppets than powerhouses. The Bible pulls back the curtain and shows us a story most of us were never told. A supernatural Cold War humming under the surface of history. This with Israel as ground zero and the rest of us caught in the crossfire. But here's the seed I want you to leave with tonight. If the nations were divided, they're also destined to be reclaimed. The courtroom of Psalm 82 wasn't just an ancient scaffolding. It was the beginning of the end for the rogue rulers. And the cross, that was the ultimate invasion. God stepping onto the chessboard to flip it for good, which means even in the chaos of our headlines, even in the mess of geopolitics today, there's still hope. The days of the counterfeit powers are numbered. The board belongs to God. So if this episode planted a seed in you, if it made you think differently about history, scripture, or even the nightly news, just do me a favor. Hit like, share this with a friend who isn't afraid of the strange side of the Bible, and leave a review wherever you're listening. That's how this show grows, how the algorithms know you're into long form high strangeness, and how we keep digging into the stories most people are too nervous to touch. So, again, I'm Bennett Tanton, and this has been Broadcasting Seeds. Until next time, keep your eyes open, keep your Bible handy, and remember, what looks like geopolitics might just be a shadow of a much older, way stranger war. Stay watchful.
Nations divided, the tower fell down. God split the tongues, spread men through the ground. But behind every king, every flag, every creed, stand powers unseen, the ones pulling the lead. Israel chosen, his portion is flame. In a cosmic cold war where nothing's the same. Empires may rise and thrones may decay, but the Lord of the board still decides to play.